The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine courtyard of Buckingham. Allo, as 8-year-old Emma clutched her father's hand tightly. This was her first visit to London, and everything seemed impossibly grand and magical. The red-coated guards stood perfectly still at their posts, their tall black hats making them look like characters from her favorite storybooks. Emma had been dreaming of this moment for months. Her father, a construction worker from a small Yorkshire town, had saved every penny to bring his daughter to see the famous royal guards. He worked double shifts and skipped meals just to make this trip possible. Emma's mother had passed away 2 years earlier, and her father knew how much she missed the bedtime stories about brave soldiers and royal adventures. Snow had fallen heavily the night before, blanketing the entire palace grounds in a thick white carpet. The other tourists were taking photos and chatting excitedly, but Emma was mesmerized by one particular guard. He stood completely motionless near the main gate, his red uniform bright against the white snow. His face was stern and focused. Looking straight ahead without moving a muscle, Emma tugged on her father's coat sleeve. "Daddy, why doesn't he move at all? Is he real?" Her voice was filled with innocent curiosity. Her father smiled and explained that the royal guards were highly trained soldiers who protected the queen. And they had to stay perfectly still. No matter what happened around them. But Emma's 8-year-old mind couldn't quite understand how someone could be so still. She had heard stories from her classmates about guards who never smiled, never blinked, and never reacted to anything. Some kids at school even claimed that people tried to make them laugh or move, but they never succeeded, as they walked closer to get a better view. Emma noticed something that made her heart race with excitement. The guards' boots were covered with snow, and there were perfect snowballs scattered around the courtyard from where other children had been playing earlier. The snow looked so perfect, so white and fluffy, just like the snow at home where she and her father built snowmen. Together, an idea began forming in Emma's young mind. She looked up at her father, who was busy reading a formation board about the palace history. Then she looked back at the guard, standing so perfectly still. The other tourists were keeping a respectful distance, taking photos from far away. But Emma felt drawn to get closer. She had always been a curious child, the type who asked endless questions and wanted to understand everything around her. Her teacher often said she had a spirit that couldn't be contained. Her mother used to call her Little Explorer. She was always discovering new things and trying new adventures. The guard looked so serious, so untouchable. Emma wondered what it would be like to be him, standing there all day long without moving. Did he get cold? Did his feet hurt? Did he ever want to play in the snow like other people? Her innocent mind couldn't imagine why anyone would want to stand so still when there was beautiful snow all around. Emma glanced around and saw that nobody was really paying attention to her. Her father was still reading, the other tourists were busy with their cameras, and the guard continued to stare straight ahead. The morning air was crisp and fresh, and the snow crunched softly under her small boots as she took a few steps closer. The snowball practically made itself in her small hands. The snow was perfect, not too wet, not too dry, just right for packing. She had made hundreds of snowballs back home with her father during their weekend snow fights in their small garden. This one felt different, though, more important somehow. Emma looked up at the tall guard one more time, seemed so far away from everyone, so alone in his perfect stillness. In her young heart, she felt like maybe he needed someone to include him in the fun that everyone else was having. Maybe he wanted to play too, but couldn't because of his job. Her small hands gripped the snowball tighter. She made a decision that would change everything. Emma took 3 quick steps forward before her father noticed she had moved away from his side. The snowball felt heavy in her small mitten-covered hands, and her heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. She wasn't thinking about rules or consequences. She was thinking about how lonely the guard looked, standing there all by himself. "Come back here," her father called out. But she was already in motion. With all the strength her 8-year-old arms could muster, Emma threw the snowball directly at the guard's chest. It hit him square in the middle of his red uniform with a soft thud, leaving a white splatter mark across the bright fabric. Impact was gentle, more like a friendly tap than an aggressive throw. But in the silence of the courtyard, it might as well have been thunder. Everything stopped. The tourists who had been chatting and taking photos fell completely silent. Cameras froze, mid-click. Even the pigeons seemed to pause their pecking at the ground. Emma's father dropped his guidebook and started rushing toward her, his face a mixture of panic and embarrassment. "Oh no, oh no, oh no," he muttered under his breath, imagining police officers, angry officials, and possibly being banned from ever visiting London again. His daughter had just thrown a snowball at a royal guard, something that was probably illegal in at least 17 different ways. The guard remained perfectly still for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Snow continued to cling to his uniform, a stark white contrast against the red fabric. His expression didn't change, his posture didn't shift, and his eyes continued to stare straight ahead. Emma stood there, suddenly realizing that maybe this hadn't been her best idea. Other tourists began whispering frantically among themselves. An elderly woman clutched her husband's arm and whispered, "Did that little girl just a teenager?" Started to pull out his phone to record what he was sure would be an arrest, or at least a very stern. Talking to from palace security, Emma's father reached her side and immediately began apologizing to everyone within earshot. "I'm so sorry, so very sorry," he said, his Yorkshire accent thick with embarrassment. "She's only 8, she doesn't understand. We'll leave right now." He gently took Emma's arm, preparing to guide her away from what he was certain would become a very unpleasant situation. But Emma didn't want to leave. She was watching the guard's face, waiting for something, anything. She had thrown the snowball because she wanted to see if he was real, if he would react, if maybe she could make him smile. Her innocent mind still believed that everyone wanted to play and have fun. Even serious-looking guards in fancy uniforms. A small crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the tension in the air. Palace security officers could be seen in the distance, and Emma's father was sure they were heading in their direction. He imagined having to explain to his boss why he wouldn't be at work next week because he was dealing with an international incident caused by his year-old daughter. The guard's breathing was steady and controlled. Snowflakes had started falling again, adding to the winter wonderland atmosphere that had inspired Emma's playful act in the first place. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. Emma looked up at her father with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy, why isn't he saying anything? Did I hurt him?" Her voice was small and worried. She hadn't meant to cause trouble. She had just wanted to include the guard in the winter fun that everyone else was enjoying. Her father knelt down beside her, trying to explain in whispered tones that the guards weren't allowed to move or speak while they were working, and that throwing things at them was probably not allowed. But even as he spoke, he couldn't help but admire his daughter's spirit. She had seen someone standing alone and wanted to include them. Even if her method was unconventional, the crowd grew larger, with more people stopping to see what the commotion was about. Someone mentioned that they had never seen anyone actually throw something at a guard before, and everyone waited to see what would happen next. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and nervous energy. Emma's father stood up, ready to take his daughter away and apologize to anyone who would listen, when something completely unexpected began to happen. The corner of the guard's mouth began to twitch. It was so slight that most people missed it completely. But Emma was watching his face so intently that she caught the tiny movement immediately. Her eyes widened with excitement as she realized that the serious soldier was fighting back a smile. Guard James Morrison had been standing at his post for 2 hours already, and he still had 4 more hours to go. He had served in the Royal Guard for 3 years, and in that time he had experienced just about everything tourists could throw at him, literally. People had shouted, made faces, told jokes, and yes, even thrown things before. But something about this little girl was different. When the snowball hit his chest, his first instinct was to maintain his composure, as he had been trained. But as he stood there, he found himself thinking about his own daughter. Lucy, who was about the same age as this brave little girl. Lucy lived with his ex-wife in Scotland, and he only got to see her on weekends when he wasn't working. She had The same curious spirit, the same fearless approach to life. The crowd was getting larger now, and James could sense their anticipation. He could see the little girl's father looking mortified, probably imagining all sorts of consequences for his daughter's innocent act. But James remembered what it was like to be a child, when the world seemed full of possibilities and adults were mysterious creatures to be understood rather than feared. Emma continued to stare at him, her small face full of hope and curiosity. She wasn't backing down or hiding behind her father like most children would. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested in whether she had succeeded in making him feel included in the fun. Her innocent bravery reminded him of why he had joined the military in the first place, to protect people like her. People who still believed the world could be a kind and playful place. James had been having a particularly difficult week. His commanding officer had been extra strict during training. He had missed his daughter's school play because of work. He had been feeling disconnected from the joy that normal people seem to find in everyday life. Standing at attention for hours at a time often made him feel more like a statue than a person. But looking at Emma's hopeful face, something inside him began to soften. The snow on his uniform was cold against his chest, but instead of being annoying, it reminded him of winter days when he was young. When snow meant sledding and snowball fights and hot chocolate afterward, it reminded him of the last time he had played in the snow with Lucy, building a snowman in his small apartment's courtyard. The other tourists were beginning to murmur among themselves, some taking photos, others looking concerned about what might happen to the little girl. James could see security officers approaching from the corner of his eye, but they were still several minutes away. He had a choice to make, and he had to make it quickly. Emma took a small step closer, her mittened hands now empty, but her eyes still full of determination. "Are you okay, Mr. Soldier?" she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. Her voice was sweet and concerned, like she genuinely cared about his well-being rather than just wanting to see him break character. Her father reached for her hand again, ready to pull her away before security arrived, but Emma gently pulled free. She wasn't being defiant. She was being compassionate. In her young mind, she had possibly hurt the nice soldier with her snowball, and she needed to make sure he was all right. James felt something he hadn't experienced in months. While on duty, a genuine connection with another human being. This little girl wasn't trying to mock him or test his training. She was trying to befriend him, to make him part of her world of snow and play and simple joy. The twitching at the corner of his mouth became more pronounced. He could feel his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack, not from weakness, but from a sudden overwhelming sense of warmth toward this brave, kind little girl who had seen a lonely soldier and decided to include him in her winter adventure. What happened next would surprise everyone, including James himself. James Morrison did something that went against every rule in the Royal Guard handbook. He winked at Emma. It was quick, barely noticeable to most of the crowd, but Emma saw it clearly. Her entire face lit up with joy, and she clapped her mittened hands together in delight. The serious soldier had acknowledged her. He wasn't angry or hurt, he was playing along with her game. The tourists who caught the wink began pointing and whispering excitedly to each other. His phones came out to record what was clearly becoming an unusual and heartwarming moment. Emma's father stood frozen, not sure whether to be relieved that the guard wasn't angry or worried that his daughter's antics were being encouraged. But James wasn't finished. As Emma giggled softly at his wink, he made another decision that would have his commanding officers scratching their heads for weeks to come. While maintaining his rigid posture and keeping his eyes forward, he began to move his lips almost imperceptibly. To most observers, it looked like he was just breathing in the cold air, but Emma was close enough to read his lips. "Good throw," he mouthed silently, still looking straight ahead. Emma's eyes grew even wider, and she looked up at her father with pure excitement. "Daddy, did you see?" he said. "Good throw. You liked my snowball?" Her voice was full of wonder and pride. Her father looked at the guard with new appreciation. The soldier, who could have gotten Emma in trouble or made their visit a nightmare, had instead chosen to make his daughter's day. The kindness of the gesture wasn't lost on him, especially knowing how strict military protocol usually was. The crowd was growing larger as word spread through the palace grounds that something special was happening. People were calling their friends over, pointing at the guard and the little girl. Sensing that they were witnessing something truly unique, James could feel the attention of the crowd. But for once, he didn't mind being the center of focus. Usually, when tourists stared at him, he felt like an exhibit in a museum. But Emma had somehow made him feel human again, reminded him that beneath his uniform and training, he was still a person who could connect with others. Emma, emboldened by the guard's positive response, decided to take their interaction one step further. She carefully bent down and began forming another snowball. But this one was different. Instead of packing it tight for throwing, she shaped it gently and carefully, making it as round and perfect as possible. Her father watched nervously as she worked, but he could see that her intentions were completely innocent. She wasn't making a weapon. She was making a gift. When the snowball was perfectly shaped, Emma walked even closer to the guard. The crowd held its breath, wondering what this fearless little girl would do next. Even the security officers, who had been approaching, slowed their pace, curious to see how this unusual situation would unfold. Emma placed the perfectly round snowball carefully at the base of James's feet, like an offering. Then she stepped back and said in her clearest, most polite voice, "This one's for you to keep, Mr. Soldier, so you can play too when you're not working." The gesture was so pure, so genuinely kind, that several people in the crowd felt their eyes getting misty. This wasn't a child trying to cause trouble. This was a child trying to share joy with someone she perceived as lonely. James looked down at the perfectly formed snowball at his feet, and in all his years of service, through all his training and all his duties, no one had ever given him a gift while he was on guard duty. The simple act of kindness from this little girl touched something deep in his heart. What he did next would become a story that people would tell for years to come. A moment of pure human connection that transcended rules and regulations and military protocol. James Morrison broke the cardinal rule of the Royal Guard. He moved, not just a small movement or a subtle gesture, but a full, deliberate action that left the entire crowd speechless. While maintaining his formal posture, he slowly and carefully lifted his right foot and gently tapped the perfect snowball that Emma had made for him, nudging it slightly toward her. The message was clear. He was playing her game. The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs of amazement. In all the years that people had been visiting the palace, and all the stories and legends about the stoic royal guards, no one had ever seen anything like this. A guard had actually acknowledged a child's playful gesture and responded in kind. Emma's. The reaction was pure magic. Her face broke into the biggest smile anyone had ever seen, and she literally jumped up and down with joy. "He played with me. Daddy. He played with me." Her voice carried across the courtyard, filled with such genuine happiness that it made everyone around her smile too. Her father felt tears welling up in his eyes. This simple moment, this unexpected kindness from a stranger, was exactly what his daughter needed. Since her mother's death, Emma had struggled to find joy in new experiences. But this royal guard had just reminded her that the world could still surprise her in wonderful ways. James felt something he hadn't experienced in years while on duty, pure, uncomplicated happiness. This little girl had somehow managed to break through the wall of military protocol and remind him why human connection mattered more than rules. Looking at her joy, he thought of his own daughter Lucy and how much she would have loved to meet Emma. The security officers who had been approaching stopped in their tracks, unsure how to handle this unprecedented situation. On one hand, the guard had clearly broken protocol. On the other hand, the crowd was responding with such positive emotion that it seemed wrong to interrupt. What was obviously a special moment, Emma bent down and carefully picked up the snowball that James had nudged toward her. Instead of throwing it back at him, she held it carefully in both hands like it was made of precious crystal. "I'm going to keep this forever," she announced to her father. What had started as a potentially embarrassing situation had transformed into something beautiful, a reminder that kindness and playfulness could triumph over rigid rules and formal protocols. People were taking photos and videos, but not to mock or criticize. They were documenting a moment of pure human goodness. James stood at attention once more, but something had changed in his demeanor. His posture was still perfect, his gaze still forward. But there was a warmth in his expression that hadn't been there before. He had remembered what it felt like to bring joy to another person, to be part of someone's happy memory, instead of just a distant figure to be observed. An elderly gentleman in the crowd approached Emma's father and said, "Your daughter just did something remarkable. She reminded all of us that behind every uniform is a person with a heart." The man's words carried the sentiment that everyone was feeling, that Emma had somehow made them all witness to something truly special. Emma carefully wrapped her precious Snowball in her scarf, determined to preserve it for as long as possible. She looked up at James one more time and said, "Thank you for playing with me, Mr. Soldier. You're the nicest guard in the whole world." James couldn't respond verbally without getting in serious trouble, but his eyes softened as he looked down at her for just a moment. In that brief glance, Emma saw everything she needed to know: that her kindness had been received and appreciated, that she had made a real connection with this brave soldier. As the crowd began to disperse, people were already sharing the story with others, pulling out their phones to call friends and family. "You won't believe what I just saw at Buckingham Palace," became the opening line of dozens of conversations that day. But the story wasn't over yet. What happened in the final moments of this encounter would ensure that neither Emma nor James would ever forget this snowy morning in London. As Emma and her father prepared to leave, something extraordinary happened that no one could have predicted. James Morrison made one final gesture that would turn this sweet encounter into a moment of pure magic that would be remembered forever. Just as Emma was waving goodbye, James did something that made the entire crowd gasp in amazement. He slowly, deliberately, and with perfect military precision brought his hand up in a formal salute, not to his commanding officers, not to visiting dignitaries, but to 8-year-old Emma. The salute was brief but unmistakable. A royal guard was honoring a little girl who had shown him kindness and reminded him of the joy that could be found in simple human connection. The gesture was so unexpected, so touching, that several people in the crowd began to cry. Emma's response was perfect. Without hesitation, she stood up as straight as she could and attempted her own salute back to James. Her small hand wasn't quite in the right position. Her posture wasn't military perfect, but the sincerity and respect in her gesture was absolutely genuine. "Thank you, sir," she said in her most grown-up voice, understanding instinctively that something very special and important had just happened. Her father watched this exchange with a heart full of gratitude. This royal guard had given his daughter something precious, a memory of kindness, respect, and human connection that would stay with her forever. In a world that often seemed harsh and unfriendly, especially since losing her mother, Emma had found proof that good people existed everywhere, even in the most unexpected places. The crowd burst into applause that echoed across the palace courtyard. People were wiping away tears, hugging strangers, and sharing in the collective joy of witnessing something truly beautiful. Even the security officers who had been approaching were now smiling and clapping along with everyone else. James returned to his rigid attention stance, but his face now carried a peace that hadn't been there before. He had broken several rules that day, and he would likely face questions from his superiors later, but he didn't regret a single moment. This little girl had reminded him why he had become a soldier in the first place: to serve and protect people, to be a source of security and comfort, not just a silent statue. As Emma and her father walked away, she turned back one more time and called out, "I hope I see you again, Mr. Soldier Friend." Then she carefully adjusted the scarf around her precious Snowball and skipped happily beside her father. James couldn't turn to watch them go, but he could hear Emma's joyful chatter as she told her father about their amazing adventure. Her voice grew fainter as they moved away, but her words carried clearly in the crisp air. "Daddy, he was the best soldier ever. He played with me, and he saluted me like I was important." The story of Emma and the Royal Guard spread far beyond that snowy morning in London. Videos of their interaction were shared millions of times on social media, with people from around the world commenting on the beautiful example of kindness and human connection. News stations picked up the story, calling it a reminder that compassion, could flourish anywhere, even in the most formal and regulated environments. James Morrison became famous overnight, though he never sought the attention. His commanding officers, after reviewing the footage and reading the overwhelmingly positive public response, decided that his actions, while unconventional, had brought honor to the royal guard by showing their human side. He received commendations. Instead of punishment, Emma kept that snowball in her freezer for 3 months until it finally melted completely. But she kept the memory forever. She wrote letters to James through the palace administration telling him about her school adventures, and always ending with your friend Emma. The letters were delivered, and though James couldn't respond directly due to protocol, he read every single one. Years later, when Emma was older and understood more about military service and sacrifice, she would still tell the story of the day she threw a snowball at a royal guard and discovered that even the most serious adults could remember how to play. And James, whenever he had difficult days or felt disconnected from his purpose, would remember the little girl who had seen not just a uniform, but a person worthy of friendship and kindness. Their brief encounter became a testament to the power of innocent bravery, unexpected kindness, and the human connections that can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. It proved that sometimes breaking the rules in the name of compassion creates the most beautiful moments of all.